Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, May 28th, 2025, episode 399. Something must be done. I made a post 3 years ago and it popped up in my Facebook memories, and it was a reference to something must be done. And after I posted it, one of my genius friends responded to me, and I had a conversation with him online uh, about this post. And I thought I would share it. It was a pretty interesting interaction. I'll read most of it, but I'll keep an eye on the time. If it's getting too long, then I'll shorten it and jump right to the conclusion. Okay. Something must be done is the mantra of the shallow, naive thinker who believes that complex phenomena can be resolved with the writing of a law or regulation. Passing coercive, inflexible rules feels great because something has been done, and there is no liability or responsibility for the results of these narrowly focused rules. But when the failures come to light, instead of recognizing their own part in creating the outcome, people dust off something must be done, and the process is repeated. Allow people the freedom to protect what they hold most dear in the manner they believe is best. Over time, we see the variety of ways people have done this, and then others may choose what meets their personal moral criteria. Otherwise, we must live in a world created by those who say something must be done. And so basically, I'm talking about the legislation of morality, where it prevents people from doing what they would think is the best way of responding to a new situation. And that is replaced by legislation. No, you can't do it this way. You have to do it. You can't do it that way. You have to do it this way. Right. And this becomes a bad situation. So my really smart, we were in the same band together. We went to school together, and he is by far much, much smarter than me, except he got narrowly focused, right? So with all the smarts, it's sort of like all the advantages that he had mentally, he disadvantage, right, is erased because now we're in a narrow canyon. And so where he's comfortable, normally succeeding, now he has sort of boxed himself in. So this is what he wrote. Equally shallow and naive is the intellectual dismissal of any action. Under such a pretense, one reduces to platitude the concept of freedom, such that it is despair rather than freedom, the mantra, nothing can be done. And so I wrote, and so basically he kind of didn't understand what I wrote. And so I wrote, the post was critical of legislated action, which is generally what something must be done, often implies and concludes with. Legislated action is coercive and narrowly focused, which is why they fail, and why it earns the label of naive. Naive, but extremely harmful, as it is plainly evident. The reality is that with freedom, everyone must do something unless government intervenes with restrictions and prescriptions, which generally make things worse. That was the second part of the post. We must have more freedom to find the best solution to any problem. Plus, there is always the problem of human error, which no regulation can prevent or account for. People generally think they have the answer. I will say it is an answer among many. Any choice involves risk. Regulations hide and shift risk and liability. With freedom, risk and responsibility and related costs are more visible, making future decisions more informed. Bad choices result in losses for those who make those choices. Good choices have more desirable results. In a free society, people pay for the choices they make. These days, we all pay for all of the bad legislation and policy made with little thought to the consequences, intended and unintended. Politicians generally do not care because they are legally protected from liability. People who are unfamiliar with the potential of freedom only see despair, I guess. I always and only see hope. And then he responds, your posts set up false dichotomies. Legislation or regulation is not the opposite of freedom. First, the opposite of freedom is tyranny or slavery, and legislation or regulation may be the tool of tyranny, but the view that legislation is tyranny is not one that is congruent. It is wrong. Further, legislation and regulation can support freedoms. Have you ever worked with hazardous materials? And like he has? Come on. The freedom to life and lives of others are supported by regulations, and in some cases, legislation regarding their proper care. The second is that any legislation that includes an emotional response is de facto not a reasonable response. It is fair to postulate that any given piece of legislation may be objectionable. It may be unconstitutional, coercive, serve only special interests, or absurd. And surely you are a bellwether in your critique of our political abuses and abusers. But that a legislative response may be emotional is not a criterion for determining whether or not it is just or unjust legislation. Reasonable and just legislation may be rooted in core commitments that evoke emotional responses, and legislation may serve to support emotional responses that are consistent with justice, truth, and fairness, virtues. We are not Vulcans. The absence of emotion and empathy impedes human reason. Of course, one could point out that your core commitments seem to produce emotionally motivated responses that are rhetorically flawed. The potential of freedom includes creating just and reasonable legislation that supports virtues and the welfare of society. So and you can tell his language is far superior to mine, right? He uses bigger words. Right? And that has always been my thing is like I steer away from larger words. And I'm sure because of, he's a professor right now as well. And so probably teaches a much more difficult, intellectually challenging material. But anyway, my response was not a false dichotomy. I'll explain later, which I never do. But anyway, but the gist is that you assume that the only regulations can come from government. Yes, I know it's a typo. I catch that, but only too late. That is false. Government regulations take away choice and liability. That's how they work. The key dichotomy is having choice or not having choice. He says, okay, but the idea that the only regulations can come from government is not a premise in what I presented or one that I hold. But I do hold that governmental regulations can also result from and allow choice and allow liability. So that's probably a good place to start. I say. And it's a really long response. I'll probably not read all of it, but he never responded to that. And I guess because it was either too long and he didn't read it, didn't feel like reading it, or he felt we were going in circles. He was saying one thing and another. And this is why I don't like online conversations. But if we were face to face, I would have shown how he's actually misunderstanding what I'm saying. And eventually, I probably would have beaten him into submission with my constant badgering of his definitions. But anyway, I say, my bad. In my rush, word order mistake. Regulations only come from the government. That's what I meant to say. Government is the source of a lot of other garbage. Don't want to shortchange them. Right. Anyway, it may be that you don't see the regulations as bad as they fall within your already existing expectations. But what about everybody else? If I may be so bold, it seems you do not understand the nature of regulations based on your comment. That's probably why he didn't respond. Though some people support some regulations most of the time, the reality is that regulations deny choice. You must do this or buy this, but only here and not there, in the name of safety and quality. In those situations, one is reducing competition for established, politically connected businesses. Customers have fewer choices, and eventually, choice is reduced to oligopolies, monopolies, and other protected industries, for example, public transportation, schools, universities, hospitals, banks, online retailers, etc. Regulations are generally protections for existing businesses against competition under the guise of safety and quality. Minimum standards function as arbitrary maximum standards to discourage innovation and change. Minimum standards remove liability by allowing businesses to say that they have met the minimum standards. Or government just simply gives insider corporations immunity, as they did with Big Pharma and the jabs. The 1990 Oil Pollution Act was a doozy, and it is the root cause of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico or America. The perception that there is some good from regulations is possible by ignoring the reality that they are coercive and all of the costs generated by those regulations, including the many, many failures of those regulations as mentioned above. It's the seen unseen argument. Sure, the few benefits of regulations are visible and are highlighted for everyone to see, on corporate media and by the Department of Education, but everything which was lost, prevented, and made more expensive because of those regulations are not and are not even considered. Plus, because of the lack of imagination, most people don't even consider what was lost in that exchange. The easiest cost to consider is the cost of compliance. People often will talk about greed, whatever that is, as an explanation for corporations swallowing up smaller businesses. The reality is that the regulatory structure makes it too expensive for smaller businesses to comply, and so they must sell their business to businesses which can afford armies of lawyers and accountants. All choices are sacrifices. Something is sacrificed for something else. One must consider trade offs in choices. It's one thing to be comfortable in one's own choice, but what about everybody else? Especially if we consider the criminalization aspect of regulations. This is the coercive aspect of regulations. Not only do regulations fail to change the behavior of some people, but many who fail to comply or break an unknown regulation often unknowingly become criminals. Prisons are full of offenders of victimless crimes, especially the drug war. I am sure all of them would agree that regulations carry a net loss with them. Lobbying becomes a factor in the world of regulations. It is another cost. However, those areas of life which are least regulated by government see the opposite phenomena. Prices go down as quality goes up without sacrificing safety, especially electronics. The free market allows people to focus on increasing quality while lowering price. The freedom of choice with liability. People must take more care that their choice does not create more harm than good. If there are damages which result from their choice, from choice, then the one who made the choice is at least partly responsible and must pay damages. In order to avoid damages, one must be sure to do research before acting. This is even more true with large corporations. They will need insurance. But there too, the government has regulated them in a way that they also fail in their role. See the BP oil spill above. And that was the thread. I thought, wow, I wrote that. I was pretty impressed with myself. I meant that as a joke because I can, it's been a while, especially since teaching middle schoolers that I write and talk that way. It's pretty crazy. But anyway, he didn't respond. Probably was way too long. He didn't feel like reading it and maybe responding. Maybe he was offended that I said he didn't understand. Because keep in mind, the dude is super, super, super smart, right? I remember when I met him in seminary, I was like, man, this dude is so smart. And anyway, so yeah, he's smart. And at the same time, I was thinking, wow, this guy's really smart. I was notorious for not being a good student. I was I was a horrible student, right? Like I mentioned before, I had too many issues with my identity, and so studying was not necessarily my priority. Studying just enough to graduate, yes, but nothing more. Uh, or, and this is my revisionist uh, history of myself. Maybe it's because I didn't want to get boxed in uh, by the teachings of other people. Like I had ideas, their explanations did not explain or resolve questions that I had. And so I kept searching. And so I kind of was always a little rebellious. Now, 3 years later, rereading this, it's a lot worse than I thought, right? So 3 years ago, we didn't have Doge. Trump wasn't reelected, right? And once he was elected and Doge went to work, we saw all of this stuff. And then there was the episode that Ryan McMakin gave the other, and that I made a podcast out of 100 years of war, pro-war propaganda, right? I mean, wow. It is a lot worse than I thought, particularly because in that whole thread, I never mentioned war. And war is by far the worst, right? It's the something must be done. We have to start killing people, that kind of thing. So my comments are probably more accurate than I had realized, and I missed the mark in scope and scale, right? So I was right, but the scope and scale of just how bad things are, I just could not fathom. I mean, I sensed it. I often said, hey, if you could print all the money you wanted, then you could bribe entire countries. Heck, you could probably bribe the whole world. And as it turns out, uh, America tried, right? So some knew all along. Like I said, the Mises Institute people, they knew all along, right? But if we could have had choice all the time, right? If we, instead of having to do whatever the government prescribed, we had choice. And so we sought out sources of information that were reliable and whose predictions turned out to be true. Those would be the more popular sites, as opposed to, you know, curated information from the government sources, which at the same time censors anyone else, right? And so that's the only option that we have, which turns out, as a lot of people, Dave Smith has been doing some episodes and Jimmy Dore about how, yeah, everything is a lie. Everything that they said during the Cervasis thing was a total, complete lie. And if that was all a lie, then why would anyone trust those same sources for accurate information, especially when it comes to war in Ukraine or Israel, anywhere for that matter? So, as long as smart people, quote unquote, smart people, genius people like my friend, buy into the possible good of government regulations, right? The theoretical, hypothetical benefits of government regulations, then we're doomed, right? If the smart people of the world can't see past their own personal prejudice, then we're doomed, right? We're doomed. They can't see the corruption. They can't see how the corruption in government affects how those legislations are written and then played out. They just can't see the bigger picture. It's crazy. And I think it has something to do with the PhD, the way that you have to pick a very, very narrow, tiny topic and then become the expert, right? And so what you know is such a narrow sliver of an even greater field, which exists within the infinite life. I think it really does train people to be narrow-minded. That was my theory for a very long time. And so my super, super smart friend is just really narrow-minded with all of his super brain power, right? It's focused on going deeper into his field, but he lacks understanding across the board. Just like Niels Tyson deGrasse, whatever his name is, right? I mean, he's super smart, I am sure, but it does not have a lot of width. There's not a lot of breadth, uh, you know, there's not a wide range of understanding in the things that he says. And, the same could be said to me, except in the opposite thing. So from my position, I can theorize what may be potentially good or bad. But when it comes to deeper knowledge, I'm not really interested, right? On the surface, I can tell if something is going to turn out bad or good, and that's enough for me. If something is good, then I'll go down that path. I don't need to learn, just how bad things can get if I make a bad choice. I just like, so do I do drugs? Well, I kind of know that's going to end badly, so I don't do drugs, right? You see? And so that's the process, except with theories and everything that I do on this podcast. And in conclusion, again, freedom is always better, right? It doesn't mean that with your freedom, you're always going to make the right choice. No, the reality is that most of the time we're going to make the wrong choice, but it's the freedom to make those choices, which then allows us to learn the most, learn from our mistakes. And so the next time around, we're going to be wiser. We're going to make a better choice, a different choice, right? We're not stuck because of a government regulation making the same dumb choice over and over and over and again. And every time it fails, people say, "Oh, we just need more money and then we can do it better." That's a mouse on a spinning wheel right there, right? And freedom always gives you an upper hand on people who are experts in their own field, right? Like there's no way that I can compete in brain power with my buddy. But the problem is he doesn't respect freedom. He does not give freedom a chance, right? Maybe he's one of those who fears freedom and would rather prefer the comfort of government regulation. I don't know, but that's what it seems like, right? But freedom is where it's at, right? Freedom is where it's at. Freedom always allows the best ideas to rise. You can't, flash your expert card. Oh, look at me. I got a PhD. Listen to me, right? And then automatically assume that you have the right ideas or the best ideas, right? I'm pro freedom because I want to know what those right ideas are, right? I'm pro freedom because I know I don't have all the answers for everyone. I barely have enough good answers for myself. So I want more freedom for other people who are smarter than me to explore, to experiment, to fail even. But then if they fail, then I know I'm going to fail if I try that. And so more freedom for more options, more lessons, more knowledge, more learning, more experience, so then we can move forward. But yeah, so it's not something must be done or nothing can be done. No, it's something must be done. Yeah, but what and by whom? And you might even be able to insert all the other questions, right? What, whom, why, when, right? All of those questions, you see, can be answered through freedom. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed my walk down memory lane, and I'll talk to you next time.